Thank you very much, and thank you so much for this invitation to present a paper. This is actually my first presentation ever in China. I was supposed to go to Fudan University just before the pandemic, so unfortunately that was cancelled. But I'm really curious to see what you think about the issue I'm going to discuss today. I have a PowerPoint, so I think I should share that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a puzzle about disability and old age. And in order to set up that puzzle, I will start by describing three different claims, and then I'll argue that these three claims together form an inconsistent set of claims, which means that we will have to reject at least one of them. And then the challenge, which I'll discuss in the rest of the talk, is which of them to reject. And I will end out with some more general reflections on the way in which the badness of disability has been discussed in much of the disability literature. Okay, so the first claim I want to describe is what I'll call the mere difference view of disability. And the mere difference view of disability is a view which typically is articulated as a critique of what was, at least in much of the literature on disability, the standard view some 30, 40 years ago, a view which is called the bad difference view about disability. And according to that view, disabilities are a special kind of bodily or mental dysfunctions that you can describe medically. And these dysfunctions are bad in themselves for the disabled person. So that means it's not a matter so much about the social environment in which the disabled person lives, which makes these impairments or disabilities bad for the person. It's simply in the bodily or mental dysfunction in itself that gives rise to the problems from the point of view of the person. And typically these views are coupled with the view that the way to address disabilities is to try to mitigate disability, to provide medical treatment for people with disabilities, or perhaps even try to prevent new disabled people from coming into existence, say by deselection of embryos which have genetic dispositions for developing disability later in life. This view in much of the last 30 to 40 years of literature on disability has been heavily criticized, and basically a lot of people have defended what they call the social model of disability. The social model of disability basically says that disabilities are socially constructed. It's not a matter of having particular bodily or mental dysfunctions or impairments. Rather, people's bodies vary a lot, but which count as disabilities and which do not depends on the social environment in which we live. And one of the standard examples is the case of wheelchair users. So in many societies, being a wheelchair user is a disadvantage in many ways. But that to a large degree, or perhaps that's to a full degree, reflects merely the fact that our public space is organized in such a way that a lot of places you don't get to access them if you are a wheelchair user. But of course, we could have organized the social space differently, such that it wouldn't be a problem to be a wheelchair user. And that, according to the social model of disabilities, shows that the bad difference view of being unable to walk is not really
recording in progress.
It's not. It's a matter of social environment. So people who subscribe to this line of argument often articulate their view as a matter of the mere difference view of disability. So on that view, being disabled is not worse in itself for the disabled person than being able-bodied. It's merely different. And to the extent that it is worse, so you don't deny as a friend of the mere difference view of disability that actually a lot of disabled people are worse off than non-disabled people. But you would say that to the extent that this is true, this is due to the fact that we live in an ableist social environment. So that's the first claim, the mere difference view of disability. And I think it's fair to say that it has been pretty influential in the literature on disability for quite a long time now. So now I move on to the second claim. And the second claim is a claim about old age. And I think that's a claim which hasn't received anything near the attention than the similar claim about disability has. So basically, I'm suggesting that you could just make a similar distinction between a mere difference and a bad difference view with regard to old age. So with regards, and I think actually most people would be inclined to accept what I call the bad difference view of old age. So on that view, being old is worse in itself and not merely different from being young. It's bad for the old person to be old rather than being young. And to the extent that it is worse, this is due in part at least to old age itself and not just to the fact that we live in an ageist social environment, if that's what we do. So here's a quote from someone who would be a typical representative of the bad difference view of old age. So this is an American philosopher, Hauskeller. He says, in aging, we experience a gradual disintegration of our bodies and often enough our minds. So think about Alzheimer, for instance. Taken by itself, this really is bad for us. That is, your aging is bad for you and mine for me. Now, I think this is probably the kind of commonsensical view of old age. Think about the quest for the source of youth, things like that. And there hasn't been, over the last 30, 40 years, a transition to something comparable to the social model of disability. That is, there hasn't been any transition to a view, what one could call the mere difference view of old age, which would say that being old is not worse in itself for the old person than being young. It's merely different, and to the extent that it's worse, this is not due to old age itself, but to an ageist environment. Just one note here. You might think that there's an obvious reason why old age is worse than youth, which is that being old means that you face a higher risk of dying than if you're young. But the way in which I understand this qualification in itself means that we should set that aside when we consider the badness of old age in itself. So similarly, there are some disabilities which involve an increased risk of death. But when assessing the state of being disabled in itself, whether that's bad, we should, so to speak, disregard that increased risk. So these are two views, the mere difference view of disability and the bad difference view of old age. And now I'm going to introduce the third view, which I'll call the biconditional. And basically the biconditional says that if and only if the mere difference view about disability is true, then so is the mere difference view about old age. So basically what the biconditional claim says is that we shouldn't assess these two conditions, the condition of disability and the condition of old age, differently. with regard to whether they are in themselves bad for the person who are in that condition. Now you might ask, why should we accept this view? And I think that one important reason why it has some plausibility, at least, is that it's an important feature of old age that generally it involves developing disabilities or conditions similar to disabilities. So deafness, for instance, is normally considered a disability. Reduced hearing is probably not, at least not when it's relatively light, considered a disability. But it's a condition very much like the disability of deafness. And it's hard to see why, if the badness of deafness is a matter of an ableist social environment, that you shouldn't say something similar about reduced hearing. That is, that the badness of reduced hearing is not also a result of a particular social environment, which is not particularly accommodating of people with reduced hearing. And I mean, a lot of old people develop at some stage deafness, and I think even if you're, 58, you can already see that you have reduced hearing compared to younger people and to what you had when you were in your 20s. That's at least one reason why it's difficult to see why the two conditions should be different. There are other reasons why people might think that old age is bad in itself, but these reasons, I think, generally apply to disabilities as well. So social isolation, for instance, is, at least in many Western countries, a feature of old age. But I think the same could be said about many disabilities. Now, if you think that these three claims are all plausible, then you would accept the three claims that's on the slide now. And the problem that then arises is that, unfortunately, we cannot accept all of these three claims. So the set of claims consisting of these three claims are logically inconsistent. So that means that take any two of them and you can then derive a negation of the third claim. So if, for instance, the mere difference view about disability is true and the biconditional is true, then it follows that the mere difference view of old age is true, but that would contradict the bad difference view. So that means that we basically face a choice, even if all three claims might initially seem like plausible claims, we must reject at least one of them. And that's a challenge that we face as a matter of logic. So it's there's no way around, it seems, rejecting at least one of the claims. So now I'll move on to say something about which of these three claims we should reject. And I'll start with the suggestion that we should reject the bad difference view of old age. I mean, if you're sympathetic to much of the social model of disability literature, that might initially be the most attractive response to this puzzle about old age and disability. I myself am quite skeptical about rejecting the bad difference view of old age. Not that I think that social environment doesn't make any difference to the badness of old age, but I do think that there are features of old age which it is very hard to imagine will not be bad for an old person in general, whatever the social environment we live in. And to try to persuade you to accept this view, consider the following thought experiment. So suppose that at the age of 30, you're offered an anti-aging pill. So that pill will not prolong your life, so you will die at exactly the same time you would die if you didn't take the pill, but it would make sure that your body and your mind would be preserved in its present stage, that is the state at which it is at the age of 30, so you wouldn't experience any kind of loss of muscular mass, no problems with loss of memory, etc. So my suggestion would be that, or my own inclination, I should perhaps say, my own inclination would be to take that pill, assuming, of course, that it was reliably tested, etc. Even if I was pretty confident that once I became 60, the world would no longer be ageist in a way which is bad for old people. So retaining memories and being able to do the things that you're physically able to do at the age of 30 seems to me to have a value independently of whether or not the social environment is accommodating of elderly people or not. Now, there are some people who would object to this thought experiment and say that there are some transactions costs involved in growing old, and these are what we're really responding to. These are what would make the pill attractive. And that would be a view which is similar to the view that has received some attention within the disability literature on the badness of disability, consisting not so much in the state of being disabled, but rather in the transitional costs that are involved in coming from a stage of being non-disabled to a state of being disabled. Actually, a lot of empirical evidence shows that after some transitional period, people who become disabled experience or report more or less the same level of welfare as before they became disabled. Now, I think in the case of aging, this transactional cost argument doesn't have much traction, though, in the light of the fact that we age very gradually. So there's a lot of adaptation going on, more or less invisibly. So for that reason, I'm not particularly swayed by that argument. Other people might say that, or object to the use of the anti-aging pill example by saying that people tend to have a midlife bias in the sense that they underestimate the value of childhood and the value of old age. And more specifically, a number of philosophers have argued that a good human life is a life which is a well-rounded life, where different segments of life have different roles to play within the narrative of a human life. And more specifically, a well-rounded life is one which includes old age, where old age involves certain vulnerabilities and disadvantages, and we would live a less well-rounded life without that phase of our lives. Now, I'm kind of neutral on whether we should accept this view about a well-rounded life, or the view that a good life is a well-rounded life with different stages. But I do think that a lot of the disadvantages that comes with old age actually is a bad thing from the perspective of this ideal of a well-rounded life. So think about Alzheimer's, for instance. I think surely old age, in a chronological sense, without Alzheimer, would be a life which would be well-rounded in the sense that you would have better opportunities for completing your projects, saying farewell to children and grandchildren, etc. So even if we go with this view, I don't think that defeats the bad difference view of old age. And finally, I should also say that the bad difference view of old age, as I understand it, is what one could call a generic generalization, not a universal. So that means that the claim made by the bad difference view is not that for each and every person, that person is worse off for being old rather than being young. The claim is rather that there are sufficiently many people of whom it is true that for them being old is worse than being young. So it's a bit like tics are dangerous. So it's not a universal generalization. So a lot of tics do not, and actually the majority of tics do not carry Lyme's disease, but some do, and that's enough to make the generic generalization that tics are dangerous true. So if we think about the bad difference view of old age in that way, it doesn't defeat the bad difference view of old age that you can point to particular persons of whom it might be true that they've actually benefited, or they're actually better off while being old than when they were young. So that makes the view harder to defeat. I should say here that in fairness, of course, we should understand the mere difference view of disability in the same way, that is as a generic generalization and not as a universal generalization. There is a different objection to rejecting the bad difference view of, there's a different objection to the bad difference view of old age, which I think is stronger, which would say that if we think about chronological age, that is the age, so that's of course stipulatively, but suppose we say that old age is the age you're in once you've existed for 58 years, and then you're old until you die. So is that bad in itself? I mean, if you're assessing merely having that chronological age in itself, then that would be compatible with having the body and mind that you had at the age of 25. And since we're also setting aside this issue about the increased risk of death, it is actually difficult to see why old age in a purely chronological sense should be bad in itself. So, I mean, we can distinguish between different senses of age. I've talked about the chronological sense. There's also a biological sense. So that would be the age if you undergo a very thorough physical examination with your doctor. Then your doctor will be able to tell you what your biological age is, and your biological age might diverge from your chronological age. So some people have a slower rate of bodily decay and have been exercising a lot and eating very healthily. And these people might have a lower biological age than their chronological age. Other people might have done the opposite, and they will have a higher biological age than their chronological age. And finally, there's also age in an experiential sense. So if you had an accident and been in a coma for 10 years, for instance, then your experiential age will be lower than your chronological age. So what I have in mind when I say that old age is bad in itself is that old age, given the sort of conditions people are typically in, setting aside whether they live in an ageist or non-ageist social environment, are bad for people. So I guess in a strict philosophical sense, I'm not assessing the bad difference view of old age is not about the badness of old age in itself, but about something which is typically associated with old age. But actually, I think this is not a problem in this context, because you can make exactly the same argument in relation to disabilities. So you could say that a disability is never bad in itself. So think about being paralyzed. If you have certain sci-fi instruments assisting you in such a way that you can move your body in exactly the same way that you could if you were not paralyzed, then the state of being paralyzed wouldn't be bad for you. But that, in this broader notion, broader understanding of in itself, doesn't show that disability is not bad in itself. So to sum up, in relation to the bad difference view of old age, I think it is a plausible view, and we should not reject it. So perhaps we should reject the biconditional instead. So that's the second claim in the trilemma. I think also that's an untenable move, and I've already indicated why I think that, or the main reason why I think that, which is that many of the disadvantages in old age and disability are essentially the same, or if not the same, then of the same kind. That is the example of deafness versus reduced hearing. So if that's true, then it's quite difficult to see why they could be different when it comes to the nature of the disadvantages they both involve. Then, of course, you could say that there are some difference between disabilities and old age, and no doubt there is. So one thing one could say is that unless one dies prematurely, one will eventually become old, whereas it's not true of being disabled, that one will, in the absence of dying prematurely, eventually become disabled. Some people never develop disabilities. Also, one might be disabled at some point in time, but then at a later point in time not be disabled. But it's not possible to be old at some point in time and then at a later point in time not be old. Or at least that's true of chronological age. I guess that in principle it needn't be true of biological age. I think these are differences between old age and disability, but they are perfectly consistent with the biconditional aim. The biconditional aim is about the badness of the two states. It's not about whether all or only some of us are or will end up in some of these states, and it's not about reversibility either. So I think a defender of the biconditional can simply concede that there are these differences. Now, people might challenge the biconditional in a different way. They might say that perhaps the disadvantages involved in old age and disabilities are of different kinds. And given that they are, there could be reason to believe that social circumstances might play out differently in relation to different to disability and old age. But even setting aside this point about one important disadvantage of old age being the fact that you typically develop disabilities, there is also the fact to consider that disabilities are really diverse. So muscular dystrophy, orthopedic speech and hearing impairments, visual impairments, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, mental retardation, HIV, specific learning disabilities, and diabetes are all considered disabilities for the purpose of the Americans with Disability Act. And it's actually quite hard to see that there are any unifying feature across these different disabilities, other perhaps than they are considered disabilities, and that people who have one or more of these features are often subjected to ableism. So if that's the case, then perhaps it's quite difficult to push. If you want to stick to the mere difference view of disability, it is quite difficult to push the diversity objection against the biconditional claim, because you would then have to concede that the state of being disabled is also very diverse, and for that reason it's very likely that different disabilities involved in different disadvantages involved in different disabilities might be very different in terms of the whether or not these disadvantages are socially dependent or not. So again, I think we shouldn't reject the biconditional claim, and that suggests that we should reject the third and final claim in the trilemma, which is a mere difference view of disability. And actually, I think there are some good reasons why we should be skeptical about the mere difference view of disability. And here I quote a disability theorist Tom Shakespeare. He says, what would it mean to create a barrier-free utopia for people with learning difficulties? Reading and writing and other cognitive abilities are required for full participation in many areas of contemporary life in developed nations. What about people on the autistic spectrum who may find social contact difficult to cope with? With many solutions to the disability problem, the concept of addressing special needs seems more coherent than the concept of a barrier-free utopia. And I would add to the two examples that he gives, that is learning disabilities and autism, depression, that's also a disability. It's very hard to imagine how we could organize the social world in such a way that it's not bad for you to have the disability of being depressed. So basically, I think we have to accept that at least for a range of disabilities, within reasonable constraints, variation in social disability doesn't affect whether or not these disabilities are bad for the bearer of the disability. It might be true that there are some disabilities which are different, that is, disabilities which do have a strong contingent social component. So perhaps being a wheelchair user, or perhaps being deaf, the social world in such a way that it's not a disadvantage for you to be a wheelchair user. So that would suggest that we distinguish between different kinds of disabilities. So we reject the mere different view of disability in general, but we then introduce a distinction between disabilities that are mitigable and those who are immitigable. And the latter are extreme forms of disabilities, say complete paralysis view of disability. We should put forward a more moderate version of that view, which would simply say being mitigably disabled is not worse in itself for the disabled person than being able-bodied. It's merely different. And to the extent that it is worse, this is not due to the mitigable disability itself, but to the ableist social environment. So basically, this is a narrow version of the mere difference view of disability that doesn't apply to hard cases like depression or autism or learning disabilities. I think there's a lot to be said for this narrower view of the mere difference view of this disability, but the question I want to ask here is whether that makes us escape the or a trilemma, and I want to suggest that it doesn't. It just lands us in a different trilemma, because we can make a similar distinction between, or we can imagine a narrower version of the bad difference view of old age. So we can say, well, old age is actually quite a diverse condition as well. If we stipulate that you become old when you're 58, then the age from 58 until 68 is probably very different from the age from 88 to 98 in most people's case. So perhaps one should simply go for a narrow version of the bad difference view about mitigable old age. And that probably is more likely to be true than the broader bad difference view of old age. The problem then is that we could also imagine a narrower version of the biconditional, which applies only to this narrower set of disabilities and this narrow set of old age. And I think that biconditional is plausibly true as well, in which case we land in a trilemma which is quite similar to the one we started out with. Perhaps it might seem easier to decide which of the claims to reject, but basically it doesn't, I think, extract us for a trilemmatic predicament. So we still have to decide which of the three claims in the weaker or narrower trilemma to reject. So, just by way of wrapping up this talk, I have 3 conclusions, and one of them is more like a reflection based on the arguments I've presented. So the first conclusion is that how we think about the mere difference view in relation to disability constraints, how we must think about similar views in relation to old age, and of course the other way around as well. I think that's an important conclusion in the sense that it's a fact that I think has been overlooked in the literature. And I think it's an important fact in the sense that, and that connects with the second conclusion, that a lot of people who've subscribed to the mere difference view of disability also intuitively ascribe to the bad difference view of old age. But if I'm right, they will have to choose. And that's the second point, or the second conclusion of this presentation. That is that, at least for many people, the age disability trilemma forces us to revise the way in which we think about the disadvantages of disability or old age, or for that matter, both. I myself am pretty certain that something like the bad difference view of old age, perhaps in a narrower version, is true, but which would imply that I would have to reject the mere difference view of disability, but other people might see it differently. The third conclusion to draw from the paper, which is more like a reflection, is rather than spending a lot of intellectual energy on deciding which of the 3 claims involved in the trilemma one should reject, perhaps what this argument as a whole shows is that being very preoccupied with whether claims like the bad difference or the mere difference view of disability are true is to ask the wrong sort of questions. And instead of focusing on whether the 3 claims in the trilemma are true, we should rather focus on different claims. And one motivation for this view would be that both disability and old age are very broad and extremely varied phenomena. And if we look at other conditions, like being the condition of being a teenager, or the condition of having a personality that is in every way statistically ordinary, then of course you could articulate views like the mere difference view of being a teenager, or the bad difference view of being a teenager. And the question then would be, does it really make much sense, or is it really that important to decide whether those truths are not, those claims are true or not? And here I think it's important to realize that the legs in the trilemma, the mere difference and the bad difference views, are generic generalizations. And for that reason, it might be true that the mere difference view of disability, even if that's true, then it could also at the same time be true that at least some disabilities are to some degree bad for the disabled person, to some degree independently of the social environment. And similarly, the bad difference view of old age might be true, even if some disadvantages that old age typically involve are completely non-existent in non-ageist social environments. So generics are good for some purposes and bad for others. And my point here would be that if we can adopt many different perspectives when we look at the condition of disability. But if we look at it from the perspective of, say, a social planner or a social reformer, it seems that it's not so important whether generic generalizations about the disadvantages involved in such complex and varied conditions like disability and old age are true. Rather, it seems that from the perspective of a social reformer, what one should be occupied with is specific disabilities or specific problems of old age, and then try to assess the degree to which they are, so to speak, dependent on social conditions, and therefore presumably dependent on conditions that we can manipulate or change in the interest of preventing some of these disadvantages for people. So this is not saying that generic generalizations are not useful for some purposes. Sometimes we have to act quickly. So if you're in the jungle and you meet a tiger, the generic generalization tigers are dangerous is useful, even if not all tigers are dangerous. I guess if they're just eaten, they might not be dangerous. But at least from the perspective of a social reformer, of a social planner, decisions needn't be made quickly with regard to disability and old age. And from that perspective, perhaps we should be much more occupied about the nature of specific disadvantages involved in specific conditions, rather than being involved in assessing the truth of very general claims like disability are not or are bad in themselves for disabled people. So I think that's roughly 40 minutes, and I think I should end here. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kasper, for the talk. And next we have Professor Bai, I don't know, from Fudan University to briefly comment on the talk. Professor Bai.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Yinjie, for inviting me, and thank you, Professor Lieber Rasmussen, for giving such a really wonderful, very interesting talk. And so I have three questions, comments, three sets of questions and comments. First, a specific issue, on page 13 of the paper you gave me. Actually, you mentioned that in talk as well. So you're saying that, what can be defended is a kind of mere difference view of, a kind of narrow, mere difference view of disability, right? So, the idea is that, the differences, can be, mitigated through, social, arrangements. But still, even this kind of narrow work, I would call it moderate, difference, view of disability. I mean, can we really eliminate, all the differences through social arrangements? If I'm a handicapped person, if you build a handicap rail for me to move up some kind of ladders, right? Steps. Of course, that disadvantage will be mitigated or even eliminated, but it could still be there, right? If I want to run to a mountain, if I want to climb up a mountain, right? You cannot build a rail for me to do that. So I think there are still residual differences or disadvantages for disabled people in a lot of circumstances, and so that's just one particular remark. Whether this view, this narrow difference view, a mere difference view of disability, can actually hold. So then I think your tactic, your strategy of defending the narrow difference view of mere difference view of disability is that it is a generic claim, right? So it's not meant to be universal. So there are exceptions, and so you could use that tactic to answer my challenge or similar challenges. Then I think you're using the similar tactic to address to defend the narrow bad difference view of old age, right? And then we can say, as a devil's advocate, people can say that, are you using this strategy selectively? Right? Because you're talking about kind of generic, right? But how much is generic, right? Maybe 60% cases fall into the mere difference view of disability, and 60% fall in the bad difference view of old age, right? But actually, we don't know, right? We can move the ladder, one or another, and so in short, the first set of objections is that maybe we can adopt the narrow or moderate bad difference view of both old age and disability. Then the trilemma would be resolved. I think, personally, I think that's my own hunch, how to solve this problem. So I find that the even the narrow difference view of disability is I think I have a problem with that view myself. So I guess, but still, so that's the first set of questions or comments. And then just related to this, if that idea is true, namely there is this symmetry, and but the symmetry suggests that maybe what can be defended is the narrow bad difference view of both old age and disability. Then why we still have this kind of, apparently among people, this kind of difference of views with regard to both old age and disability, namely the mere difference view of disability, but the bad difference view of old age. Why there's such a difference? Something you said in the paper actually gives me some hint. You're saying that old age comes to us all, right? More or less, right? But disabilities are problems for some people, probably a minority, maybe and also in the end, you're saying that the mere difference view of disability has a social benefit, right, for us to address the social factors that create the disadvantages for the disabled people, but not so much in the case of old age yet. I think if you put all these things together, maybe the reason for the different views between old age and disability is that it is politically incorrect to say that disability is a bad in itself, because it sounds discriminatory, right? You're discriminating against a minority. But if you say that old age is bad in itself, you're saying something bad about all human beings, which is, in the case of, in the environment, in the politically correct environment, that's okay to say. It's not okay to say a minority is bad. It's okay to say all of us are bad, right? So maybe that's my kind of cynical, guess, explanation about the difference. If in reality there's no difference between old age and disability, I mean, there's a symmetry, if that's the truth, right? But why apparently there is this kind of dissymmetry, or lack of symmetry, then maybe, our political motives play a role in that case, right? So that's the second comment. The third comment is something you mentioned in the paper, both in the paper and also in the footnote, in the main body, also in the footnote, the idea that there's something good about being old. You're referring to Socrates in Plato's Republic, right? I think that's a conversation between Socrates and Cephalus, and Cephalus being this really old guy, very old person, and it's kind of interesting. Socrates went to Cephalus' house, and the first thing he asked Cephalus is that you're at the threshold of old age, meaning you're dying, right? So I really like to know how you feel about that, right? If you think about it, it's really very offensive thing to say to your host, very generous, and very tolerant host. The answer Cephalus offered is really interesting. He said that, most of my friends feel bad about old age, right? Because they don't have money, they're being abused by their family members, and they're going to die, right? But he said, I'm okay, right? I have a lot of money, so I live comfortably, and I do the sacrifice for the gods, and God will take care of me after I die, right? But I think more related to your paper is the idea that he's saying that, now I'm old, I cannot have sex anymore. And so I'm being freed from this tyrannical master, right? And finally, I can read books, right? And so when I'm teaching this passage, I always tell my students, you should not do philosophy when you're so young. You should go out and find partners. And so when you're old, you cannot do sex anymore. Then read philosophy. I mean, that's Kafka's lesson. But so that seems to suggest that a disadvantage can be accompanied by an advantage. Right. And so maybe that suggests a different approach to the problem of disability and old age, or being disadvantaged in general, instead of rejecting the existence of disadvantages, saying that they're socially constructed. I mean, of course, many of them are socially constructed, but there are still, non-socially constructed disadvantages. Instead of denying those things, maybe we should say that, of course, there are disadvantages, but with these disadvantages, there are also advantages, right? I feel very good now that I'm not disabled, but maybe when you're disabled, you can gain new perspectives to the world, right? And so maybe that it's a different solution. It's still a politically correct solution, right? But acknowledge the disadvantage while affirming a more kind of, you could say, unequal but pluralistic view, right? So you're not as good as I am in this regard, but you're better than me in another regard, right? So it's unequal, but overall, right, we're on the kind of equal setting still, right? And but just one last comment on this, on my own suggestion. The funny thing in the Republic that Kepler's, in order to show that being free from sex is good, he quoted Sophocles. He said Sophocles. Someone said, asked the same thing to Sophocles, right? The poet, and he said that just shut up. I'm really happy that I'm freed from this master, this tyrannical master of sex, right? But it turns out that actually Sophocles has been a sex maniac throughout his life, right? And so maybe sometimes we cannot have it both ways, right? When there's a disadvantage, the advantage never happens, never comes, right? Maybe sometimes life sucks. So on this high note, I'll stop. Thank you.
So should I briefly respond, or
you could?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. These are terrific comments. Thanks a lot, Professor Bai. These are, just very briefly on your second point, which I guess is about how to explain the fact that a lot of people subscribe to the disability, the mere difference view of disability, and not very many people subscribe to the bad difference view of old age. I only want to register that I think that's definitely a large part of the explanation. So I'm perfectly in agreement with what you're saying here. With regard to the first comment, I think I should say here that you might well be right that I'm perhaps a bit selective in my use of the appeal to narrow mere different view of disability being a generic generalization, and of course you could say the same thing about the narrow bad different view of old age, and one cannot have it both ways. One have to, so to speak, use the same generic in both cases, and I do think that, as you say, even when we're talking about these mitigable disabilities, you can
在使用达芬奇字幕轨道时，会发现一个长句子会被自动分成几行。想要调节字幕的宽度，发现简答题里并没有这项设置。
If you want to climb Mount Everest, it will be a disadvantage to be a wheelchair user. But of course, and that perhaps connects with your third point about, which I think you nicely connected with your second point about political correctness, saying that old age, it's too simple just to say that it's bad for you. It's a mixture of advantages and disadvantages, and I guess you could say the same with disabilities. And I'm completely on board with the view that old age, for instance, in the view of Plato, involves advantages as well as disadvantages. I guess some of the advantage of being rich, I mean, old people tend to be richer than very young people, at least. I guess that's an advantage. It's not an advantage in itself of being old. It's, so to speak, even on my broad understanding of what in itself includes, I would say that this is an advantage which is perhaps statistically associated with being old, but it's not an advantage in itself. But I think I'm very sympathetic to, well, perhaps partly for political correctness reasons, to instead of talking about the overall badness of old age or disability, to talk about specific disadvantages and specific advantages of both conditions. And perhaps you're also right in this interesting remark about how some of the disadvantages might even go hand in hand with some of the disadvantages. So your increased interest in reading philosophy might actually, which is an advantage, might actually come hand in hand with the disadvantage of not having strong urges to find a partner or whatever. So just by way of a final remark, I think these are really excellent comments, and I think I think I'm in agreement with them. I think with regard to the conclusions I presented, I think your comments are in a sense consistent with the conclusions, because my main aim is to present the trilemma, or the narrow trilemma, and then to show that many people will have to revise how they think about the badness of old age and disability. And perhaps one of the ways to go would be the one you indicated in your last remark, that we should think about, so to speak, the mixture of advantages and disadvantages involved in the different conditions. And of course, people are very adaptive in the sense that if there are some benefits you can read in old age, and you can also read them in young age, but there you have many other alternatives, then perhaps being adaptive, you focus more on the benefits that you can reap in old age. And if you manage to do that, then perhaps it mightn't be such a problem for you that you've now cut off for a number of benefits that you had the access to when you were young. But thank you very much for some excellent comments. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kasper. Professor Bo, would you like to briefly say something?
No. Yeah, thank you for and because my responsibility is to read some questions. I really enjoyed the paper greatly, and I think in the end the conclusion is, as Professor Liber Rasmussen said, actually it's kind of consistent with my overall comment as well. And I think it's also very different, very important to consider issue both, maybe case by case, also from different perspectives. I think it's very important that Professor Liber Rasmussen mentioned, from the policymaker's perspective, maybe whether the mere difference view of disability is false, or the very different view of OH is true. Maybe it's not that important, So so in that sense, I really appreciate this rich perspectives that this paper offers. Thank you.
Thank you. I see someone raising hand. Dr. Zhang Yunjie from Fudan University. Would you like to speak by yourself? Hello? Dr. Zhang? Yeah.
Hi. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's a little bit glitch. Thank you so much. I mean, like both of you, I really enjoyed your conversation. It's really funny. So your argument, sorry, I don't know how to correctly pronounce your name, but your argument is clear and strong, and but that doesn't mean I agree with you. So I just want to push a little bit further. Like, could you consider a thought experiment that if, let's say me, did something wrong and will be punished for take like a pill, and I have two options. Like, one is to make me old, and the other is make me disabled. Like, according to you, being old and being disabled are both like intrinsically bad, or your words, like bad in itself. So for my own goodness, like which one I should choose, like which one is actually less worth of, or they just do the same, or depends on like what kind of age or what kind of like disabled functions I will get. Like, yeah, I just wanted to hear a little bit your thought.
Thanks a lot. That's an interesting thought experiment. I haven't thought about that. I think for the purpose of making my argument, I don't think I need to take a stand on whether old age, how the, so to speak, the badness of old age that's not dependent on social environment, how that compares to the badness of disability that does not depend on social environment. So I think from my point of view, we would have a trilemma, even if the two badnesses in question were exactly of the same magnitude, or whether the badness of old age is greater than the badness of disability, or the other way around. So I think I can simply stay neutral on that question. And whenever, in order to make an argument, one can stay neutral on a question, then one should do that. But of course, you can then push me, and that's my second response, and say, but what do you think about it? So do you think that they are equally bad, setting aside what derives from different social environments, or don't you? And I think in order to give an informative answer to that, one would have to know something about the specific effects of the pill. So would I become someone like me, say someone who's 58 years old, or would I become 98 years old and have the conditions that typically comes with being 98 years old? And similarly, what kind of disability would you
我们就把时间交给安东老师。那另外一方面，安东老师大概今天会讲个40到45分钟左右吧。然后呢，后面的评论人是来自华东师范大学的哲学系的蔡曾老师蔡老师是研究
be a bit reluctant to take any of them before I learn more about Well,
好的
actually,
那
how
我们
old I
先
would
把这
become
个时间
and
给
what
安东老师。
exactly,
安东老师，你就
what kind of
开始吧。
disability I
好
would
的，好的，
develop
好，
if I had the other pill.
谢谢王老师的
And I suspect that,
介绍
I
以
mean,
及
if the pill,
及
the old
就是
age
对这
pill
个
would
这个问
turn
题
me
的
into someone who
背
is
景
105
给
years
了一
old,
个特别
the
详细的
disability we talk
说
about
明，
is
我觉得对这个对听众
hearing
来说，如果
impairment,
不太了解
then I
这块的话，
would go
还是
for
很有
the
帮助的。
disability pill. But if it's a matter of becoming, well, 58 years old, like I am now, or
就正式开始我们的讲座。
becoming paralyzed completely, then I would go for the old age pill. So I don't know if that answers or responds to your comment.
Yes, it's sort of. So then it will go back to what you discussed with Dr. Bai, like the kind of age or the kind of disabled functions you're choosing is actually selected. If especially after my question, like
可能就是因为
I understand.
心理背景的一些
So I feel like maybe
背
that's
景就会人有的时候就会有一些
because
奇
for
怪
me,
的
like I
行
feel
动
like yes, there must have some fundamental differences
我还以为是
between
刚才
being
说的
disabled and being old. Yeah, maybe that's the part I cannot
背景
agree
最自然。
with you. Well, except that, I think everything is super clear, and I thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see whether someone else has a question. Anyone? Okay. Dr. Liu Haiying from Fudan University, our faculty here, our new faculty here at the School of Philosophy. Dr. Liu.
Hello. Hi. Hi, Professor Rasmussen. Thank you for your talk. And I also have a question. Say, given just to ask a disabled, quote unquote disabled person, and maybe who's blind or deaf or disabled in some other, handicapped in some other ways, and just ask them, now suppose that you have a pill that can treat your disability at this point. Would you prefer to do that? I have a hunch that many people will even if they think that, even if they say that being disabled is merely different, they may still prefer to take the pill to treat their disability, and which seems to suggest that perhaps deep down they also think that being disabled is bad, right? Although I know that perhaps in certain communities they will do it different. They will think a different way. For instance, perhaps in some deaf communities where most people they communicate with sign languages and they are deaf, and they may even choose to have their kid being congenitally deaf rather than be born with the ability to hear. So I guess maybe this is different in some communities, but I guess maybe for some other communities where there's not much cultural identity formed around their disability, they may still prefer to take the pill that treats their condition. So would that suggest that perhaps ultimately something like something like that position of considering handicap and disability as bad is maybe more plausible, just that people don't want to admit that way?
That's an excellent comment. Thanks. There's a lot in there. And you're perfectly right that this pill hypothetical, so you can apply it to disability and you can apply it to old age, like I did. And like you, I suspect that many people, if offered the hypothetical with regard to disabilities, would actually, I mean, if they have a disability, they would like to take the pill, setting aside some of those cases you mentioned. Say if you are part of a group of people who are all deaf and community via sign languages, you might fear that if you take the pill, then you will be cut off from the community and that will be bad for you. With regard to that scenario, then in order to test whether that speaks to the issue of whether deafness is bad in itself, what you're responding to here is really not the badness of deafness itself, but the badness of losing your social connections. So I guess in order to test that, we should develop a hypothetical where we imagine that all the people in the deaf community together decide whether or not all of them should take a pill, such that if they all take the pill, they can still continue forming a community and keep their social relations. But they can also hear if they take the pill. And if in that scenario, people would say, well, we should all us in the deafness community decide to take the pill, then that would speak in favor of deafness being bad in itself. But you're perfectly right that, I mean, this kind of pill example is one that has also been employed in the disability literature. Perhaps that's what you're referring to as an argument against the mere difference view of disability. And I guess in a particular strong form, one could compare two hypotheticals. So in the first, you're young, but you can have this pill which would make you old. And then the second hypothetical, you're old, but you can have this pill that would make you young. And I suspect that many people who would perhaps not have a strong view about whether the mere difference view of the badness of old age is true would say that insofar as there are one of these offers that are attractive, it's the offer to take the pill that would make you young if you're old, rather than the pill that would make you old if you're already young. I mean, that I would assess these two scenarios asymmetrically, in the sense that I would be much more confident that it's the make you young pill that would be preferable to the make you old pill.
应该可以看到吧？
Can I just maybe try to add some, maybe ask a question about another point just for clarification? Because it seems to me that the age part and the disability part, how they affect well-being. In this aspect, it seems that they seem to differ in two dimensions. Like being disabled, we typically think about just disabled person regardless of their age. But the problem with age is that it's not just that one is being disabled, but also at that point one has expectedly less time to live, right, compared to being young. So I guess in the original case of taking the pill that you suggested to whether old age is merely different or just bad. I think that the kind of pill you are suggesting is not the pill that changes person's age, but just say keep their body, keep their physical and mental status the same way as they are until they die.
我的这个题目海报上面是之前写的是作为逝世的哀痛，那个但其实主要关注的还是刚才王老师说的这个情绪的恰当性，尤其是哀痛这个情绪的恰当性。那个恰当性呢，其实是整个一个大的刚才王老师也提到了，情绪作为可以被进行规范性评价的这个维度当中的一个特别的。
Being old in some ways involve a whole lot of disabilities that I think you have suggested in a high chance of disability, and that can cause a lot of trouble. But on the other hand, being old also means that one has less time to enjoy a whole lot of welfare, and that's also a situation that comes in. And so that's one dimension, the different from being disabled. So I guess when you say given the offer of being young but taking and getting old pill and being old and taking a young pill, the difference is it could be a different thought of a change. Here it becomes a question of how much time that you can still be in the world and enjoy your life. And another, the question that you are talking about about like whether being old and being disabled is good or merely different. I think it has more to do with, say, how much it will affect your mental physical capacity.
没有书。
Correct.
Okay, that's really interesting. So one thought that strikes me now when you were talking was that perhaps you just invented or introduced a new concept of chronological age. So when I talked, I made this distinction between chronological, biological, and experiential age. And when I talked about chronological age, I've had in mind the number of years you've existed since you came into existence. But if I understand you correctly, you're suggesting that there's a different concept of chronological age, which is the number of years that you have left until you will cease to exist. So in a sense, I think that's a perfectly coherent concept of chronological age, which is, I think, a very interesting conceptual pair to the ordinary chronological age, where we talk about because we don't know when we are going to cease to exist. We know when we came into existence, and therefore the number you get is the number of years that have passed since you came into existence. But you could in principle have instead numbers expressing the number of years that you have left to exist. And perhaps if we knew when we would cease to exist, that would be the age that we would typically state when asked how old we are. And you're perfectly right that in these kinds of thought experiments I make about this pill, it's not a matter of testing the badness of chronological age in your sense, because that's not affected by taking the pill or not. It doesn't affect when you die, so it doesn't affect your chronological age in your sense. So what I am assessing is, as you say, more like the being in the state of body and mind that people typically are when they are in old age. And so in that sense, I might be misdescribing what I'm doing. I think my excuse for doing that is that similarly, when people are assessing the badness of disability, they probably aren't assessing the badness of disability in itself in a strict sense, but they are assessing the badness of being in the conditions and circumstances that disabled people typically are. So I mentioned this example of a person who's paralyzed in the sense that his nerve system doesn't function properly, so he cannot decide to raise his arm, and then he will raise his arm. But he has this chip operated into his brain, which enables him to, via some computer, raise his arm whenever he forms a volition to raise his arm. And then, I mean, if that was a perfect computer and a very powerful chip, perhaps this person could be paralyzed without actually having any of the disadvantages involved in being paralyzed. So that would, I think, speak in favor of saying that here we're not really assessing the badness of being paralyzed, but badness of these conditions typically associated with being paralyzed, just as my thought experiments didn't assess the badness of chronological age in your sense, but the conditions typically associated with the badness of having a not many years left to live in, something like that. Mm-hmm. But that's very helpful with the this other notion of chronological age. I've never thought about that, but perhaps that needs to be taken into account as well in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. And thank you, Kasper. I see some audience have another question in the chat box, so I will read it out. She said, thank you, Professor. And my question is, when you defended the benefits of aging, you said it may bring some advantages of maturing, like the tranquility and wisdom. Why I think I think physical decline is a steady and inevitable process for everyone, but not every old person will become wiser. What do you think about this?
I think that's a fair point. So, I mean, I guess I think everyone knows someone among their friends or family where they would say that not only is it a matter of the person not having become wiser as this person has grown older, but it's more like the reverse. So I think that's a good point. So I guess what I should say here that perhaps there are some respects in which, I mean, it's different from person to person, but perhaps there are some respects in which growing older gives you, on average, greater tranquility or wisdom, better ability to, so to speak, restrain your temper or whatever, postpone making important decisions until you've reflected probably on them or something like that. But I mean, I think it's a compelling observation that not everyone will achieve these benefits of aging that we've been talking about. And that, of course, weakens the case for saying that old age is not bad in itself for you. I don't think I have more to say to this, but that's a good point.
Okay, so we'll probably all agree with this, as far as although it's been cruel to say that. Let me see. Is there anyone who want to ask questions? Anyone? Professor Bai, would you like to say something? Do you have a question? No? Oh, okay. So I have a question for myself. So the difference, the distinction that made between the definition of disability and old age reminds me of a fundamental distinction that we made in the philosophy of medicine regarding health and disease. When I first read this paper, it reminds me of what we think of social construction of the disease, especially in the definition from the perspective of philosophy of medicine. So, how would that relate to your view, your personal view regarding how should we define the concept of the disease? I don't know whether I speak it correctly, but my question is that the relevance between our understanding and definition of the concept of disease is kind of related to how we define disability. So what's your view?
Sorry.
Yeah, you go ahead.
So just, I mean, this is just to try to clarify to me what you want to address. So I think I would think of it in this way, that, I mean, old age is not a disease, but it's a condition which typically have very important implications for your health. I don't know whether one should think of disability as a disease, but it's certainly, I mean, I guess that probably depends a lot on whether you go for the social model of disability or not. And in that case, you certainly wouldn't say that it's a disease, and probably not also a health problem. I mean, if you are a wheelchair user, you might in many ways have perfect health. But perhaps I'm missing something here, because I think I'm simply comparing the badness of two conditions. And for the purpose of comparing the badness of two conditions, do you think I need to take a stand on whether the conditions I describe are best characterized as conditions of disease or conditions of lack of health or something else.
You can take perspective, but I'm not quite sure about that. I don't know whether your personal view regarding the definition of disease is different from the mainstream, such as the biostatistic view or social construction view. Do you have any idea on that?
I do have some thoughts on, I mean, if you take the biostatistical view in relation to health, whether it should be age discounted or not. I mean, if you don't age discount, then presumably being old, or most old people have bad health, in the sense that relative to what's biostatistically average for young people, they score much lower on most parameters, and I guess the motivation for having this biostatistical notion in the first place would probably suggest that you should age discount, such that you can be 90 years old and have a good health as a 90-year-old, even if you're barely able to walk, because, I mean, on average, people do find it very hard to walk when they are 90 years old or something like that, or 100 years.
Okay. We're about the time around for 1 hour and a half. So if there is no question, let's say thank you to Professor Kasper Lippert Rasmussen, to Professor Bai Tongdong, and to other audience who raised their questions. I will see you on our next talk.